The ferry ride to the middle of Charleston Harbor can be a journey back in time.
And that's where the actual first shot of the American Civil War would have been fired from.
In 1860, Fort Sumter, the federal sea fortress guarding Charleston, became a flashpoint in the tensions between North and South.
South Carolina saw it as an affront to their sense of honor. It was a symbol of everything that they felt they were rebelling against.
It's a ride author Erik Larson took to write his new book, The Demon of Unrest, about the events leading up to the bombardment.
Who haven't read the book, let's try to summarize it briefly.
Yep.
The essence of it is that there was an effort by a number of southern states led by South Carolina to secede from the Union. And this began more or less under President Buchanan before Lincoln. So what was the main concern that the South Carolina legislature had? But what was the main concern? Why would they want to secede? What was the problem?
The South, particularly South Carolina, had long felt itself to be subjected to the tyranny of federal rule. South Carolina had always been a touchy, or tetchy, as they would say back then, a touchy state in terms of its alleged rights and what it could and could not do, even at the point where the Constitution, the various elements of it were being negotiated. South Carolina was first and foremost to say that there had to be something in the Constitution that would allow the foreign slave trade to continue in perpetuity. The other negotiating people from the North and so forth, or more wise and humane souls, would not go for that. So there was this significant conflict. So one thing leads to another. South Carolina in 1832 leads the so-called nullification effort. They just decided, okay, again, citing the Constitution, but not really, the idea that in South Carolina they could nullify any federal law they chose. And happily, Andrew Jackson, who was president at the time, was like, no, that's not going to happen. The story advances. South Carolina continues to feel like it's been completely abused. Big element, the fuel in South Carolina was, of course, slavery. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It was all about slavery.
So South Carolina secedes from the Union when Buchanan is president. Mm-hmm. Buchanan doesn't really do much about it.
Nothing.
Lincoln is elected president in November, doesn't take office till March.
Right.
He says in his inaugural address, I'm not going to do anything to affect slavery where it already exists because it's protected by the Constitution.
Right.
So why did people in the South and the South Carolina particularly not take him at his word? He said, I'm not going to get rid of slavery where it already exists. It's protected by the Constitution. Why didn't they believe him?
You know, that is one of the mysteries of the whole saga. It's like, I think you can kind of come back to another sort of contemporary thing we have now. And back then, they were in their own echo chamber. You know, they had come to believe that Lincoln was going to abolish slavery, that he could say all he wanted about protecting slavery, but he didn't really mean it. That's
So if South Carolina secedes from the Union, that means that the Union forts and Union troops in South Carolina are not really they're in a foreign country in effect now.
right. Let me just sketch the situation in Charleston Harbor in that period. You know, the United States, the federal government possessed numerous establishments in the Charleston Harbor area. There was Fort Sumter. Sumter at this time was incomplete. Construction had begun in 1828 and it was still not complete. The guns had not been mounted. The fortress was meant to have 650 soldiers. At this point, before the action begins, it had essentially none. Some laborers who were working on the fort. So the U.S. controlled these properties, and that really rankled South Carolina. That really rankled because, again, they felt that the North was this tyrannical force. And here in the harbor was this federal presence, and this Fort Sumter galled them the most. It had this gigantic flag flying from the top of this, fortress with 50-foot walls and 3 tiers of guns and so forth. It really pissed them off.
So Lincoln decides he doesn't want to give up Fort Sumter because that would be symbolic that we are recognizing the secession of South Carolina. But does he send more armaments and food and other supplies to Fort Sumter to make sure they can hold out for any attacks that might occur?
Right. This is the question that confronted Lincoln literally the day after his March 4th inauguration, because Major Anderson had sent a report saying that basically he was running out of everything and would have to surrender the fort. And so then the question confronts him: what do we do? To send an armed expedition into Charleston Harbor at this point would have been suicide for those who were entering the harbor, because Beauregard had so reinforced it that it would have been a disaster. But he comes to the opinion that he has to do something. So he does something that's really very clever. He decides, okay, we're going to send essentially humanitarian aid. We're going to send food and non-military supplies to Fort Sumter. And he notifies the governor of South Carolina. He says, this is what we're going to do. If you do not molest this expedition, we will simply unload the supplies and we will leave the harbor and the status quo will be preserved. And he knew, I have to believe, that South Carolina at this point was not going to go for this. To South Carolina, to Charleston via telegraph, which was present and very, very active media element at this point. South Carolina then realizes, okay, they don't believe him. They don't believe that this is just an expedition that's bringing food and humanitarian supplies. They are convinced that this is a military expedition with the intention of seizing Charleston, seizing and reinforcing, not seizing, but reinforcing Fort Sumter, and so forth. And that's why they finally decided, okay, this is over, and the bombardment